Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to all here at the forum, and welcome to all others watching the webcast. I thank you for your interest in connecting science with society. I'm Bassam Shakhashiri. I'm in my 53rd year in the chemistry building at this great public university. And I'm not done yet. We live in the most advanced scientific and technological society in history. Our discoveries, our inventions, our innovations, and our stewardship contribute to the quality of life of all inhabitants of the planet. And we in science, and everyone else outside of science, must responsibly deal with adverse consequences of our research and technology. In science, we all do what we do because it interests us. It satisfies our curiosities. We enjoy it. However, we have a responsibility to humanity as a whole. Science and society have what is essentially a social contract that enables great intellectual achievements, but comes with mutual expectations of benefiting the human condition and protecting the planet. We in science, in collaboration with others, must enlighten and enable people to make informed choices, to be skeptical, and to reject shams, quackery, unproven conjectures, and to avoid being bamboozled into making foolish decisions where matters of science and technology are concerned. Society makes progress in addressing critical issues by having both a skilled, creative, and productive workforce and a citizenry able to judge the risks and enjoy the benefits of advances in science and technology. We must assure that the next generation of scientists is both highly skilled and technically and properly educated to carry on their scientific and educational work for the common good of society. In a free and civil society, people must be virtuous as well as technically skilled. Holden Thorp is editor-in-chief of the family of science journals that are published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Holden Thorp is a native of North Carolina. After graduating from UNC Chapel Hill, he went to Caltech, where he earned his PhD degree in chemistry in 3 years. After postdoctoral work at Yale, Dr. Thorp joined the chemistry faculty at his alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill. Very quickly, he then became chair of the department, then dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and then chancellor of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He became chancellor in 2008 at age 43 and served through 2013. From 2013 to 2019, he was provost at Washington University, St. Louis. In 2019, Holden accepted the appointment as editor-in-chief of Science magazine. Dr. Thorp is a founder of biotechnology companies and has served on advisory boards of pharmaceutical companies. And he currently serves on the board of directors of the public broadcasting system. It is especially noteworthy that Holden has written several musicals and has performed in theater. Holden Thorp is outspoken about connecting science with society. He fearlessly speaks about research, the professional conduct of scientists, funding, and all matters related to education. As a remembrance, I'm pleased to present Holden with a replica of the sifting and winnowing plaque affixed to the side of Bassam Hall. It reads, "Whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, we believe that the great State University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. An exemplar to scientists and to higher education leaders. Please welcome Holden Thorp."
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. I treasure this. I think I'm very happy to have one, but have you thought of sending one to your legislature? I'm not sure Scott Walker and some of your legislatures have ever actually read that. So I'm very sorry for making you look at this photograph for this long. I know it's an unpleasant experience, and many of you have told me that already. So I'll try to get it off the screen as soon as possible. In fact, like maybe now, just so you don't have to look at it anymore. But it's really great to be here in Madison again for the first time in a long time. Judith Burston and I were assistant professors the last time that I was here. As Bassam said, I've had a number of adventures since then. When there are a lot of students in the room, I always have to correct some of the introduction, because it's true that I was the chancellor of the University of North Carolina for 5 years at a very young age, and it's also true that I got run over by a truck because my party lost the 2010 election, and at the same time I got a letter from the National Collegiate Athletics Association accusing us of doing things that were against the rules that are now permitted. So I also had very bad timing. But I still enjoyed my time as the chancellor of UNC, and I got to do a great job at Washington University in St. Louis after that. So it's always good for the students when you hear these glowing introductions to realize that there's usually a lot of drama and failure and stuff like that along the way. So that's a very important part of it. Also, my first biotechnology company went bankrupt and filed Chapter 7, which I didn't even know existed. I'd only ever heard of Chapter 11, but it turns out Chapter 7 is even worse. But now I have the privilege of doing one of the best jobs in all of science, and I spend almost all my time thinking about how scientists observe and process things and how they interact with each other, and writing about them in my editorials, and then also reading their letters that they send me about the decisions that we send them, which are a great way to get to understand scientists' behavior. It's in that sense, it's very much like being in administration. I understand you had an installation for your new chancellor, and just remember her job. Nobody in Madison knows how hard her job is except people like me who come to visit and her. So take it easy on her. You need to keep her for a long time. Because every time you change one, you just spend money and hire a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing yet. Okay, so that's not what I came to talk about, though. I came to talk about the interaction of science with politics. And a lot of people ask me, well, how come this talk isn't called How America Lost Science and How to Get It Back? Well, if you want that talk, I am not the right person to give it. I'm somebody who writes for other scientists. My message is for other scientists. And my message is about what has science done to make it easy. What has science done to make it easy for people to undermine us? What Joe Rogan and Donald Trump and all these folks need to hear is not a message that I'm the right person to give. I'm a person who writes for other scientists. So this talk is about what has happened in science in the last 80 years that has caused us to have this moment where the President of the United States can take out a diagram made by his own meteorologists and change it with a magic marker and a few other unpleasant things that I'll show you later on. Now, some people think that the solution for this is for us to pretend like we don't have political views. First of all, I don't think that's good for anybody's soul. Scientists, as I know better than anybody else, or as well as a lot of people, are human beings who experience emotions and have flaws and do all kinds of other fascinating human things that make my job interesting. And so trying to suppress all of those traits doesn't seem like a good way to achieve anything. So if you're somebody who believes that we should all just pretend like we're automatons who stare at our spreadsheets and just make completely objective conclusions, fully free of motivated reasoning and our own assumptions and biases, then this talk isn't for you. That's not what I believe. I agree with Albert Einstein, who famously said that scientists should be involved in politics, and he was involved in a lot of politics where there were very important things for him to be objecting to. I think this statement was actually made to an official in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. So I'm grateful that Albert Einstein knew that politics were an important arena for him. All right, so let me just remind you what my job is. I'm the editor of Science and the Science family of journals. We have 6 journals. One is Science, which has an astronomical impact factor. But another thing I say when there are students in the audience is if you have your whole career as a researcher and you send a whole bunch of papers to Science and they all get rejected, you can still be the editor-in-chief. Okay? So it's great to get a paper in Science, and I hope a bunch of you do, especially those of you who think you might not be able to and that we can surprise. But it's not a defining thing in your career. We get 12,000 papers. We publish 750 of them. And if you ever get the print copy of Science, which some of you aren't old enough to have probably ever seen, but if you rip it down the center, in one hand you'll have a research journal, and in the other hand you'll have a magazine that's about science. And in the other hand, that's the part I spend most of my time on, and we have news and commentary for scientists. A lot of people get very confused and think, I want you to put stuff in there that I can hand to my next door neighbor or my crazy uncle who doesn't believe in climate change. Like, I am not the right person to talk to them, okay? There are really gifted people who are good at talking to people who disagree with them. We don't put any of that stuff in our magazine. We put news and commentary that other scientists want to read, all right? And our metric is, if you're a physicist, is this an article about biology that you would find that you might take the time to stop and read, all right? We have 5 other journals. 4 of them are specialized subscription journals, and then another one is a larger open access journal, Science Advances, which, like Science, covers everything from social science all the way to stuff where satellites send signals to each other and there's some kind of quantum interference that I don't understand at all. Okay, we have 30 award-winning journalists who cover stuff all over the world. We cover drama in Washington and in other science apparatuses in other continents and countries. We cover mistakes that people make in science. We cover sexual harassment in science. And I learned journalism by being there's 2 ways to learn journalism. You could go to journalism school, or you could be the subject of investigative journalism. I did the latter one, okay? That is a less pleasant way to learn journalism than going to journalism school, all right? But it is another way to learn it, okay? If you get a call from an investigative reporter, don't listen to your lawyer and your PR people when they tell you not to talk to them, all right? I've been on both sides of this. You'll get better coverage if you talk to us, all right? Absolutely. If you don't talk to us, you're going to end up as a bullet on one of these lists. Okay, the commentary section we call that Insights. It has all of these different article types that I hope some of you have seen from time to time. And they're all written by scientists for other scientists. Occasionally we'll get a celebrity or a really big government figure to write an editorial for us, or somebody that a lot of people know. But for the most part, everything in our commentary section is scientists talking to other scientists. We want the insight section of science to be the best place in the world for doing that. Okay, so around the time that I was born, this happened. John F. Kennedy went to Rice. He gave a speech about why we should go to the moon. Of course, the space program is partly about science, but it's also about geopolitics and a lot of other things. But the way he talked about it was about science. And he said, we do it because it's easy, not because it's hard. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard, which is one of the most famous inspirational quotes of my lifetime. All right? So this was, 15 years after the end of World War II, after the beginning of the federally funded science apparatus in the United States, and at a time when support for science was politically extremely strong across the whole country. All right? Where do we live now? Well, I showed you one example. Here's another one. One of our greatest public servants in the history of science, the best known scientist in the whole world now, half of the country wants to put him in jail. All right? So based on him just doing science and talking about it. All right, so how did this happen? All right, now like I said, a bunch of political stuff happened that I'm not really going to talk about except the ways in which we enabled it. All right, so get a political scientist to come tell you that part. I'm interested in what we did to make this easier. So the good news is here. This is a pretty recent Pew study. So if you look at trust in various institutions, scientists are still way up there. So medical scientists, 80%, the military, 77%, scientists, 77%. I can't tell if this says that medical scientists aren't scientists or scientists aren't medical scientists. But anyway, the numbers are close enough that it really doesn't matter. All right, and then you can see journalism and elected officials and all that stuff is way down here. But if you ask another question, which is, scientists should blank when it comes to public policy debates about scientific issues, either take an active role in policy debates or focus on establishing sound scientific facts, there's a partisan divide. The majority of Democrats want scientists to be involved in policy debates, and the majority of Republicans want to be given scientific facts that then they decide what they're going to do with them. Okay, and this is really the crux of the political situation that we find ourselves in. Science, as Bassam said, is part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We are firmly committed to scientists taking an active role in policy debates. All of the surplus that I generate with the journals that go to the AAAS is precisely to fund that. So it's unambiguous where we in our organization fall on this, and we don't think that it's possible for us to just hand off journal articles to politicians and have them decide what they're going to do with them, all right? Which makes you laugh even when you think about it. But the people who are in the green, those are the people who write to me when I write something about politics and tell me to stick to science. All right, they want me, I guess, to just write formulas and things in my editorials. So they don't, they disagree with Albert Einstein and think that we should all appear neutral to the world, so that I guess we can have as much support as we can get. But I don't think really that it's us being political that has caused the divide. I do think we've enabled it, but I don't, with some examples I'll show you in a minute, I don't think we've necessarily caused it. All right, so this has been a hot topic on social media recently. So science is nonprofit. So we do not make political endorsements. Now, absolutely no one who reads our magazine would be uncertain about who I voted for. But we don't make explicit political endorsements because we're a nonprofit in the United States, and that's it would probably be against the rules for us to do it, but it would just be a dumb idea. But because Nature is for-profit and Scientific American, they formally endorsed Joe Biden for president. And so did the New England Journal. And at the time, we were all emailing each other trying to figure out which one of us had more hate mail. We thought it would be good to centralize it all and just have one person respond to all of it. So Nature went out and said, you know, we need to cover politics now more than ever. I agree with that article. And then a month ago, there was a paper in Nature Human Behavior, which I guess the people who disagree with Nature would say is to their credit that they published this in one of their journals, showing that there was a measurable amount to which people who disagreed with their endorsement said that they thought that Nature's endorsement eroded their trust in science. Now, I have a lot of questions about this and whether, I'm sure the finding itself is correct, but being the editor of one of the two journals, Science or Nature, I really don't think there's a whole lot of people in the public who know what our publications are. When I introduce myself to someone who's not in academia and say I'm the editor of Science, they say, oh, do you mean Scientific American? And I say, no, Science? You mean Science, just like all of it? So I really don't think that going to somebody and saying there's a publication called Nature and they endorse the candidate that you didn't vote for, does that change your opinion of this journal that you never heard of? Is something that we should use to change our behavior, but there are plenty of people who disagree with me about that. So Nature publishes this, and then they doubled down and said, yeah, we published this paper, but we're still going to keep endorsing political candidates. All right, so this is a fun debate to get in, and there's plenty of places in social media where you can engage in it. And you can find all kinds of, and I went on social media and said that even though we don't make endorsements, I totally support Nature's right and opportunity choice to do this, and that this is a debate that scientists need to be engaged in. All right, so I think of sort of four things that we have done over the last 80 years that have made this easier for people who want to undermine science. So the first is a complete misunderstanding of why it is that people don't understand science. And that's something that experts in science education and communication call the deficit model, which is to say the reason that somebody doesn't understand whatever concept you want to pick is because we haven't done a good enough job of explaining it. And so that causes a lot of people to write to me and say, you need to make more cool videos and put them on your website because that will help climate deniers see that climate change is real or that evolution is real or whatever it is. I'm a lifelong educator, and I believe most people can learn things if they want to. So the reason people don't know things is not because they don't have the ability, it's because they don't have the interest in teaching themselves. All right, so all of this, but scientists who are inexperienced in education and pedagogy, many of them come to the conclusion that this is all a problem of the fact that we have too many equations and too much jargon and we haven't done a good enough job explaining everything. Yes, we have all those problems. There are plenty of places in the world where you can go see things explained without all of that stuff if you really wanted to engage with it. All right, the second is something that the historian Naomi Oreskes, who's one of my teachers when it comes to all this and somebody who straightens me out when I say something that isn't accurate because I'm an amateur when it comes to all this, says, and that's something that we've had in the United States ever since we have had the federally funded apparatus, and that is supply-side science. Now, that's the idea that if we just publish enough papers that are accurate and we fill the journals with them, eventually the knowledge will find its way to the right place, and somebody will do the good and wholesome thing with it. All right, we've had 80 years to test this. I'd say we can declare that idea dead. All right, it's certainly not the case that we can just continue to pump out information and expect that it's going to be used in a wholesome way. I mean, the pandemic is a perfect example of it. We got all the reductionist parts of this correct. We described the virus. We published the crystal structure of the spike protein on February 19th, 2020. So just imagine those of us who are old enough to think of when cryo-EM didn't exist and so many other things, that you'd have a new virus and the most important protein, you had a structure of it before you'd even had a pandemic declared, only 6 weeks after we had the sequence, right? So it's not our ability to figure these kinds of things out that is the problem, all right? But we still have half the country that doubts the vaccine and won't wear a mask and all the stuff that we've had to put up with. All right, the third thing is really being naive about the fact that the political disagreements about this are somehow driven by the science itself. All right, and I'll show you some examples of why I think that is not something we should spend time worrying about. You hear people all the time, oh, why are you politicizing this? Like, we're the ones that politicized it? Cancer research isn't politicized, but climate research is. So is that us? It's the same kind of people doing cancer research that are doing climate research with the same tools, the same principles, the same computers, the same institutions, the same kinds of training. And somehow if you're a cancer researcher, you're less politicized than someone who works on climate change? I mean, that defies logic. All right, and then finally, and this is the hardest one by far, a lot of the misinformation that gets spread is done using information that comes from people within our own community who have credentials that the public can't differentiate between them truly being an expert on something and them not being an expert on something. Because they have tenure and they're professors at some university that sounds famous, and for some reason most of them are physicists. I'm sorry if there are physicists here, but the number of physicists who are willing to go on TV write to me and say, I'm an expert in virology, just seems to climb by the day. And so I apologize to all the physicists. We still want your papers, but tell your colleagues that they're not experts on epidemiology, all right? Okay, so part of our problem is telling people a really bad story about what science is. It's not old white guys with facial hair in bathtubs or getting hit on the head by an apple, all right? It's not even any individual person, all right? Science, as we all know, is a social process carried out by thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that happens over a long period of time. And Isaac Newton did not think of gravity in 1 second, and whatever he thought about gravity was mostly wrong. The person who had my job at Nature for a long time, John Maddox, used to say when people asked him how many papers in Nature were wrong, he'd say, all of them. All right, because we're going to change all of them. Absolutely every single one is going to be revised and updated and socialized. And the authors on any one individual paper are not really the discoverers of anything, all right? They may be the first people to write it down. They may be the first people who framed it in a certain way. But there are lots of things in their papers when they first come out that are going to get refined over and over and over again by a vast universe of people, all right? And that's a more complicated story than to say, we're giving the Nobel Prize to these 3 people, or we've got Archimedes running out of a bathtub. But that's not what we do, all right? And we are suffering from the fact that we have not explained this to people, all right? And we haven't done a very good job of explaining our human frailty. So these are 4 finches in the lunchroom. They say finches don't look now, but there's a creepy guy staring at our beaks. That's Charles Darwin, all right? But evolution did not become knowledge the day that Charles Darwin got off on San Cristobal and saw the finches. It didn't become knowledge the day that Origin of Species got to the bookshelves. It became knowledge over at least 100 years, while lots of people evaluated it and kicked it around and argued about it and yelled at each other about it and published papers about it and figured out the molecular basis of it and worked out genetics. And by the way, Darwin was also a racist and a sexist jerk. All right, does that mean Darwin wasn't a good scientist? No. We're not canceling Darwin or evolution by saying Darwin was a racist and a sexist. We ran an editorial by Agustin Fuentes at Princeton on the 150-year anniversary of the Descent of Man, which is a cringeworthy volume if you'd ever read one. And then we got all this guff from the heterodox crowd about how we were canceling Darwin or canceling evolution. All right? Darwin was a human being, had human flaws. All right, and by the way, Alfred Russel Wallace discovered evolution at exactly the same time and probably didn't get credit for it because Darwin had more money than he did. Took hundreds of years for evolution to become knowledge, and I've stretched my knowledge of the philosophy of science about as far as I can, but you could get a serious humanist to come explain Popper and Kuhn and a lot of these other people who understand all of the humanistic parts of this a lot better than I do. All right, so scientists certainly are human. We're subject to all flaws that humans have, including motivated reasoning, but the scientific process is social and self-correcting. Research only becomes knowledge when validated by the scientific community, and of course, the more diverse the group is that's doing all this, the more different kinds of ways of looking at things there are, and so you don't have one set of biases that have to get washed out, right? Because the more different backgrounds you have, the fewer different patterns of motivated reasoning you would have, and the faster you're going to get to scientific consensus. Okay, and a lot of the people who say, oh, well, you're just, you believe that climate change is caused by humans and that it's a crisis, and so if I have a paper that presents evidence to the contrary, you're not going to be fair to it. Or the one that's hot right now is about whether COVID came from the lab or came from an animal. We have published on COVID coming from an animal. We have not published on COVID coming from the lab, and despite what you read on various right-wing websites. The reason is because no one submitted us a paper with real findings in it that we could send out for review about COVID coming from a lab, because there isn't any scientific, most likely because there isn't any scientific information that would do that. But if there was such a paper, do you think we would want to publish it? You better believe I would want to publish that. I'd be mad if Magdalena Skipper got to publish it in Nature. That'd be a blockbuster paper, okay? If there's a serious lab leak paper out there that's going to change the way we think about all this, I definitely want to publish that in Science, okay? And I promise you, it would be the biggest paper ever. I think that's an easy promise to make because I don't think that's going to happen. But if it does, of course we want to see it. So this is a paper that we published last year about the mass of the W boson, which is a big thing to particle physicists. And there's an experiment that suggested that the mass of the W boson was higher than people expected, and that messed up the standard model. Now, it is going to be decades while physicists argue over whether this measurement is interpreted correctly and whether it really does disrupt the standard model, all right? But certainly the standard model is something that physicists have a massive investment in, all right? So if we did this groupthink thing where we only publish stuff that we agreed with, there would be very few papers in Science because most of the papers that are in Science are papers that change the way we think about things. And we certainly wouldn't have run it on the cover if it was W boson has predicted mass, all right? That would not have gotten into Science, okay? And we would not have run it on the cover, and we would not have been on every news outlet with this. But what the people who think we're not objective don't understand is we don't change our minds about scientific consensus just because we read something in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal or listen to a podcast. We change our minds about scientific consensus when people send us papers and we have them reviewed and all the data are posted and the code are posted and there's a preprint and then there's a full paper and lots of people get to work on it and then a whole bunch of more people publish more papers to follow it up. That's how we change our mind. We don't change our mind by watching television. And thank goodness, because these are principles that we've built up over centuries that we know are reliable. And they make it so that in the long run, it doesn't matter whether the editor of Science and Nature are liberals or conservatives or whether they doubt this or don't doubt that, because in the end, this process is going to continue to play itself out and science ultimately will get to the right answer. Not because of the traits of any individual person, right? But because of the power of the collective work that the scientific community can do. And the more we facilitate that, and the more diverse we make it, and the more humane we make it, the faster we're going to get to the right answer. So if anybody knows somebody who has a lab leak paper that's serious, please send it to me. I don't want to see it in Nature. All right, so now about the supply side science. So I'm going to say a bunch of things about the Surgeon General of Florida. He and I have never actually talked to each other, but I've written a lot about him, and he's had people write a lot about me. So he used to be a physician at UCLA, and before he became the Surgeon General of Florida, he was a strong proponent of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine as cures for COVID. So this is from an op-ed he wrote in the Wall Street Journal that cites one randomized trial you can link to and a meta-analysis that you can link to. These are both preprints. The top one was withdrawn as a preprint. You have to work pretty hard to get a preprint retracted, but it's possible, okay? So when you send off your preprint, don't think, oh, good, I'll never have to worry about that again. That's always going to be out there. No, you can't have a preprint retracted. He managed to do it. And then the meta-analysis that he's talking about was never published in any peer-reviewed journal. Meanwhile, there are probably more randomized control trials showing that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin don't work against COVID than anything else we've ever had in pharmaceutical science in history, all right? So just filling up the journals with all of those randomized controlled trials didn't stop half of America from believing this, all right? So there's two things about that. One is we don't need another one of these trials. We can keep doing them till the cows come home and it's not going to change anything. And the second is it's really not the scientists that caused this. Is the fact that the scientists kept doing these studies over and over again responsible for this political divide? Certainly not, all right? And part of that comes from the fact that we have a hard time recognizing that there are more parts to science than just research. And that is really a challenge in academia. And it's one that I've been on all sides on in my career. But if you look at the pandemic, the research part, we did just fine. The part we didn't do well was all of this other stuff. Being great communicators, great teachers, science policy people. All right, I live in this world now. And unfortunately, most of these folks don't get the same respect from their research active colleagues as the researchers do. And that's unacceptable. I tried never to tolerate it when I was an administrator. It's really unattractive. If you went to an educated person and said, yeah, one of the problems we have is that the researchers don't think the great teachers are as good as they are. All right, now that's harsh to hear, but you know how many times I've heard that in my office? More times than I can count. You know how many times graduate students have come to my office in tears because my boss lost interest in me because I'm going into industry instead of academia, or because I want to go work at a museum? We should want people who get PhDs to do absolutely whatever they want to do, and we should celebrate it, all right? And if the human element of that is not enough for you, then the fact that we got half the country that doesn't think climate change, evolution, and vaccines are real should tell you that maybe we should be celebrating our great teachers, our great policy folks, our great people in informal science education, and our great communicators just as much as we celebrate our Nobel laureates. And that's really an unfortunate thing. You probably know who these people are. That's Chanda Prescott-Weinstein. She's a really great astronomer and a communicator about astronomy and justice and science. Carl Sagan, who didn't get in the National Academy because the members of the National Academy thought it was unseemly that he was on television. Catherine Hayhoe, who is evangelical Christian, but she's very smart about science and she's good at communicating about climate change. If you want to convince somebody of climate change, get her, not me. And Dolly Parton, who's probably potentially the best advocate science could ever have. But unfortunately, this is a sad story, but I put Dolly Parton in a solicitation for an important science meeting. And the response I got back was, why would we want to have Dolly Parton at our conference? Like, I can't imagine a human being who exists who could do more good for us than Dolly Parton could. She's adored by both sides. And she's a strong advocate for science. Get her to come to Madison and give the commencement address and give her an honorary degree. All right, so this playbook, and then I'll skip to the end. So this playbook started with the Scopes trial, which we're right at the 100-year anniversary of. All right, now most people would say the Scopes trial was about people who didn't understand evolution. All right, now based on what we've been talking about, was that really what the Scopes trial was about? No, it was about whether racism can be challenged by genetics and biology. It was about whether public education should basically even exist. It was about whether parents should be able to provide individual guidance to their children. And these are basically all things that we're arguing about right now, still 100 years later. But if you're somebody who doesn't want, who is on the particular side of these issues, it's a lot easier to debate whether evolution is just a theory or not than it is to debate whether public education should actually exist. And so this is all a mechanism by which the discussion of these real issues can be avoided. All right, I'm going to skip this for the time being, but we'll come back to it. I'll leave it one more example. And that is so hopefully you know who these three people are. This is Jane Lubchenco, who's one of the best science policy people ever in my lifetime. She's currently the undersecretary at OSTP. Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina, who won the Nobel Prize for working out the ozone layer. These three people went to see Newt Gingrich in the 90s to try to drum up bipartisan support for climate change. Newt Gingrich understood what they told him. He was not in the dark about what they were explaining. What he said was, that's fine, but Al Gore's for this, so I can't be for it. So again, is it our fault that this, should we be spending all of our time trying to figure out how to unpoliticize something like this when, in fact, it's politicized by its very nature? And the reason it's politicized is, and I will show you this, it's very easy to understand how these issues sort out based on whether they require more or less government regulation. All right? Ronald Reagan said, I'm the scariest words in the English language are I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And ever since then, we've had people undermining science on climate change, COVID, tobacco, acid rain, nuclear weapons, ozone, public education, and guns. We can study all of these things. And we can show that gun control makes the world safer and that, all these things that you all know. All right? But the only solution to any of these things is for the government to impose regulations. All right? Now, people on my side haven't done as many of these, but they've done some, and especially my musical heroes who fought nuclear power in the 1980s, which is leading us to a world where we're recharging our battery-operated cars with coal-fired electricity. So, you know, when the liberals are against something, it's because they want more government regulation, right? So this isn't about the science. It's about an ideological debate about how much government regulation we're going to have. And, you know, the science doesn't have that much to do with it. Okay, now let me tell you one more thing about the Surgeon General of Florida. So after his first round in the Wall Street Journal, he became the Surgeon General of Florida and was appointed with tenure to the medical school faculty in Gainesville. He has a, you know, because of the sunshine laws of Florida, all the documents came out, and his academic CV is very strong. He would probably get tenure at the medical school at the University of Wisconsin. He has an excellent academic resume. So he was appointed at UF, and then he put out this study that he said showed that the mRNA vaccine was not indicated in males 18 to 39. Now, there is a very measurable small risk of cardiac complications that come from the mRNA vaccine. But those risks are small compared to the risks of getting COVID, okay? And there was nothing in this study that he posted, which had no authors, was not submitted to a journal, and was not even on a preprint server, that he used to justify this conclusion. And there was nothing in there about what the risks of getting heart disease from COVID were, only that there was a measurable risk of getting heart disease from the vaccine, which had already been established. All right, so I wrote a piece about this, and then my friends at the Wall Street Journal who've now written about me 3 times, I'm living rent-free in their heads, which I didn't know I was aspiring to. Say that I'm not a scientist because I rejected ideas that the Surgeon General wanted to debate on Twitter and wanted to put in unreviewed scientific, unreviewed documents. They weren't not really scientific. And so because I refused to do that, I shouldn't call myself a scientist, so as you can see here. So first of all, this is great for me when they do this, because my clicks go up enormously, and I get thanked by people who agree with me for doing this, which are most but not all of my readers. But the thing that then happened is that because of these very same sunshine laws in Florida, the earlier versions of this paper were eventually disclosed under FOIA. And there was, in the earlier versions of the paper, data from the same study showing that the risks of getting heart disease from COVID were much, much greater than the risk of getting heart disease from the vaccine. But they were removed before the final version that was used to make this ruling was printed, all right? And look, there's not a thing we can do in our labs about this. This isn't a lab problem, right? We're not going to do more research with pipettes in our hand that's going to fix this. All right, so the title of the talk is How We Lost America, How to Get It Back. All right, getting it back is going to be hard because not only, as I said, not only did science lose America, but America also lost science for the most part. But here's the stuff I hope I've left you with that we could talk about. So first, you know, we have to do something much harder than just putting posters of Darwin on the wall in our office. And we have to actually teach people what science really is. And that's going to be a lot of work. And the informal science education community, and as Bassam said, I have the honor of being on the board of the public broadcast system. We need stuff on PBS Kids that's not just, oh, look, I'm throwing a ball in the air. It's, this is how science works, because we are going to have to convince, young people that science is different from what we've been saying. We need to teach the history of science in college. This is another tough message for my academic colleagues. Do you really have to teach all those courses in quantum mechanics or mass transport? Could you take one or two out and teach them some of the material that we've been sitting here talking about? Does it really matter in today's world that you have 8 thermo courses or whatever it is to get a Chem E degree? Or could we take a few of those out and tell people a little more about how science actually works and about how it's used and about the politics of how it's done? Now look, I know I was a provost. I know how hard that is. But we have nobody to blame but ourselves for the fact that we're not teaching our undergraduates much of anything about all the material that we've been sitting here talking about today, and that's on us. We have to value communicators, educators, and policy folks, industrial scientists, as much as we value researchers. We have to deal, this is probably the hardest, deal with members of our own community who facilitate misinformation. But in my opinion, it's not squelching free speech to say that someone who is unqualified shouldn't be writing op-eds about something that they don't know anything about, if they're our colleagues. Now, administrators have one hell of a hard time with this. A lot of the people who've been within the world of science who have said a lot of stuff that has harmed us have been at Stanford, and I've debated this with the president of Stanford. He feels like he's gone as far as he can to say he disagrees with them. But this is a really hard conversation that we all need to have. If you're a chemist and your colleague in chemistry is off writing op-eds and white papers about something they know nothing about and not sending it to a scientific journal for scrutiny, then I think we're going to have to figure out how to do something about that. Because as long as Joe Rogan has got somebody on his podcast who's got a PhD and is a faculty appointment at a good place, his listeners don't know the difference between organic chemistry and climate science, right? And so, but that's something we really have to think about. Okay, first, then we have to be comfortable with the fact that we're human beings. It's probably better to say that we're scientists who have human flaws, but the process of science corrects for those in the long run, than it is to say we're these special people who don't have all the same human traits that every other human being has, but somehow we still manage to interact with each other and do all this stuff. I started off with this. If you don't like science talking about politics, you're either going to give me a hard time in the questions or you left by now. And then we have to deal with our own internal problems because just because we also have motivated reasoning and political views, we have sexism, we have racism, we have homophobia, we have problematic articles from our past that we haven't commented on, and we have people who cheat on their papers. And we have to straighten all of that out because otherwise the people who are undermining us have even more to go on than if we don't straighten all of that out. So I work with a bunch of geniuses. These are the editors who handle your papers. We're all going to write a joint memoir one day that's going to be called Sorry We Didn't Have Better News for You. But we try to do it with compassion, and we try to get back to people quickly. But when these folks look at your papers, they're looking at them very closely, more closely than you would get at any other journal, and they're making the very best decision they can. And it's an honor to work with them, and they're just as good at science as any of my academic colleagues have been at all the wonderful places that I've been. These are the people that make science the most beautiful journal in the world and make the website work most of the time. And when it doesn't, please let us know. We'll fix it. And thank you all for your attention. It's great to be in Madison.
Thank you, Holden. You have no you have no idea how refreshing your talk is. I said earlier I'm not done. You know why I'm not done? Because I don't want him to be done. I don't want you to be done either. Understanding and refreshing our knowledge of the process of science is good. But the other part of what Holden has at least got me to think more about is just as important for the survival of science. And we don't know how to do it. But we can be creative, we can be inventive. The process of science is different than the process of socializing science. So I'd like to now open the floor for some comments, questions. There are microphones. Just raise your hand. Somebody will bring the microphone to you. And identify yourself and ask a question, unlike what I did. And Holden, you're a professor, so you can do. Oh, thank you.
Give Bassam some love. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
While I give everybody here a minute to find your hands, we did have one question online that I'd like to address. What caused the rise in the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Oh, what caused it? Oh, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that part of the science, but I would say that part of the problem is that kind of like I did at the beginning of this talk, which I always try to do, we only ever tell the glossy story of our lives, and then we start believing it. So that's probably not a rigorous social science answer, but that's an anecdotal answer.
Thanks very much for your talk.
Yeah.
I'm Jim Lattis from
Yeah.
the University Astronomy Department. It's your emphasis on the history of science at various points resonates very strongly with me, at least. And just thinking about you referred to 80 years at one point of the arc of history that we've been seeing. And part of that 80 years was at the beginning a strong growth in the study of the history of science, the founding of departments, for example, here at the university in 1940, the first department of the history of science. But it feels like in our history of science department no longer exists as an independent entity, and that's not an uncommon development. I wonder if you have any comments on, given the importance of the history of science to the many of the problems you've been talking about, and I agree thoroughly with that. What's been happening to the history of science? Yeah. Is that not tied up? Is this tied up with some of these other political things, regulation, deregulation, or whatever sorts of movements might have undermined its study?
No, I think that it's still a pretty vibrant discipline, but as you said, it's been absorbed into the history departments. Most history departments that I know have been a part of, well, the two that I've been a part of, both have history of science as an important subdiscipline of history, just like American history and European history and all that stuff. I think that and I spend more time talking to historians of science than almost anybody else in the writing that I do, because that's the part that I'm not a professional in. And so what I would say from talking to them is that we don't have a good handshake with the history of science as a subdiscipline. And it's two-way. They're very skeptical of us, because we think science is the solution to absolutely every problem. And some of us do. And that's a very fair criticism. But most of these things that we've been talking about are things that science is not the solution to. You know, I'm sure he probably regrets saying this, but you know, in one of his exit interviews, somebody asked Francis Collins what he wished we knew more of. He said, well, I wish we knew more about where hesitancy comes from. Well, the historians have been writing about this for 100 years, if not longer. And so, you know, we have to not only embrace the history of science, but we have to read their papers. And they have to be patient with us when we say things about history that are wrong, which frustrates them. But the ones that, now, you know, I have a privileged position to interact with them in, but the ones that I talk to a lot, Audra Wolfe, Naomi Oreskes, Jill Lepore, those folks are very patient, helping me make sure I get things straight. And they should spend more time doing that. But we should also be willing to give up some space in our curricula for their classes. And if we did that, it would help also boost things for the humanities, which is something desperately needed in higher education, because if it goes away completely, you know, we're going to have a real big problem on our hands, since that's the part that we seem to keep screwing up. Yeah, in the back.
Oh, hi. I'm Natalia. I am a graduate student in microbiology. And you kind of touched on my question a little bit. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on, because I also think the history of science is really important because it has also framed a lot of how we think about science and how our own biases have affected, you know, the science, like how we think about it. So I was wondering how we could engage students more in the history of science and like maybe increase enrollment, because like seeing it as something separate from science I don't know how we would approach having students engaged in that kind of class or curriculum, and if we should be including it in our curriculum as we kind of teach these courses, or like what were your thoughts on how to include the history of science into our curriculum?
Well, people learn things when they want to or they have to. So we either have to make people want to learn it or we require them to learn it. I'm for requiring it because, you know, people always think it's strange that the editor of science wants students to take fewer science classes. But if you sit in my chair, I don't deal with anybody who doesn't know enough science. But I deal with a lot of people who don't know enough about human behavior and how we got here and the history and stuff like that. So from my perspective, it would be better to have scientists who are better trained in the humanities and social sciences and train themselves in science, which is something that they desperately want and need to do. So, but then, you know, that sounds good, but then you have to go to a meeting where the organic chemists say, we're not giving up our class, and the physical chemists say, we're not giving up our class, and the inorganic chemists say, we're not giving up our class, and the next thing you know, there's no requirement there. You know, I gave this talk one time in an engineering school, and I said, well, maybe we ought to just get rid of ABET. That's the organization that says these are all the requirements for a Chem-E degree, these are all the requirements for civil engineering, whatever. There's not a lick of anything about the humanities or social sciences on those lists. So guess what? Engineers don't learn any of this stuff. We don't ask them to.
Hello? Okay. We're going to do one more online and then one more in person. The online one is, thank you for the talk. While I do agree that humanizing scientists may help get America back, I wonder if there may be a side effect of having more people distrust science, as seeing scientists as humans may downplay their experience.
Right. So there are plenty of people who disagree with me and ascribe to that very view. And these are the same people who write to me when I write a tough editorial and say you shouldn't do that because you're either alienating the other side or you're showing what our bias is. Again, my solution to this is if we taught people what science actually was, rather than something done by lone geniuses with facial hair, then that would be the remedy to that. In the short term, I mean, I absolutely am sure that the study in nature of human behavior, which in my opinion asked an arbitrary question, but I'm convinced they got the right answer to it. The question is, how important is that compared to, making real long-term gains when it comes to all this stuff? And I guess my conclusion there, maybe this is pessimistic, is that there aren't any short-term gains. There's plenty of social science that shows that, for example, if you had invited me here, and I don't do this anymore, I did it some at the beginning, but now I've seen enough research to suggest that it actually hurts more than it helps. If you said, oh, we've got a very famous climate denier who wants to come have a debate with you, that is not good for anyone. There is zero evidence to suggest that that changes anyone's mind. You can test that. That's been tested multiple times, and it doesn't help anything, right? Because the people, and every time I've done one of these, all the people who agreed with me, but when they came, wrote to me and told me how great I was, and all the people who agreed with the person on the other side did the same thing for them. So I don't think that there are very many. I mean, people used to say to me, why do you write all these pieces about Trump? Well, I can tell you why I didn't write them. I didn't think that Kayleigh McEnany was going to print them out, take them into the Oval Office and stick them on the Resolute desk and say, Mr. President, you've got to read what the editor of Science says because we really need to change our policies. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think we have to make long-term investments in young people. The good news is the enthusiasm among college students of even those who are conservative for the environment and a lot of the things that we care about. Young conservative people, for the most part, are largely in favor of gay rights and even trans rights. I mean, I hope that situation will resolve itself. So I think young people have the potential to come to this in a different way than we did. But I think people my age and older, we're the ones who made it like this. So the worst, and another thing about this that really bugs the crap out of me is all this stuff about free speech and everything where people are blaming the students. Really? I mean, we wrote letters to them saying, we want you to come to our college and we're going to take good care of you and we're going to create a place where you can express yourself. And then we're going to say that what's wrong with higher education is that the students want trigger warnings or they had a protest at some speech? No, they didn't create this situation. We did. We should be the ones to deal with that. But man, if I have to open the New York Times and read one more op-ed about how the snowflakes at Stanford Law School are the problem, the snowflakes at the Stanford Law School are not the problem. They're brilliant students doing precisely what they were told they could come to Stanford and do. It was the university's responsibility to make sure that they could do it safely. And for them to be blamed for that after the fact is really irresponsible. Guess I've gotten on Stanford a lot today. I don't know why. All right, next question. Yeah, last question.
Hello.
Okay, hi.
I'm Tom Zinnan. I'm with the Biotechnology Center and with Wisconsin 4-H. You just called out a distinction between science and social science.
Yeah.
And I'd like to invite you, or as a question, what would it take to convince you to not do that again?
Oh.
What would it take to have you insist that people include the social sciences in the definition of STEM?
Yeah, so you don't have to convince me.
But you called it out.
No, I'm going to tell you
distinctly.
what I need. You don't need to convince me that I shouldn't do it. But
Okay.
you need to explain to me how to avoid doing it. So we publish social science in Science. Not everybody agrees that we should do that. But we have a social science editor, Akamo Zagara, who's outstanding. We also have social science and science advances. We have 4 absolutely outstanding deputy editors, Jennifer Earle, Jonathan Katz, and Aaron Clausette and Mark Aldendorfer, who handle social science for us at Science Advances. So what I need to stop doing that is a way to acknowledge the importance of social science with a different word. So if you tell me, so when I say science and social science, I'm saying that as a tribute, that we should include what we refer to as social science in our discourse. I'm not trying to differentiate it from science or the humanities. They're all scholarship, and if we lose one part of those 3, we're eventually going to lose all of us. Like, you know, a lot of this stuff about, for example, you know, should we be worried about the fact that African American studies is under attack and that the College Board caved and changed the curriculum? Well, yeah, because if you did precisely the same thing to AP Environmental Studies that they did to AP African American Studies, you'd be taking climate change out because they took out everything from 1970 to today. So we have to give just as much support to our colleagues in the humanities and recognize their scholarship as legitimate, and to the colleagues in the part of the university formerly known as social science, which you're going to tell me what to call from now on. So if you tell me how to do that, I'd be delighted to stop saying social science. I thought that's what you wanted me to call it. So feel free to straighten me out. It was great to be with you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, brother.
Thank you all for joining us. I'd just like to make one more comment about the plaque, the replica of the plaque. The plaque is very important to me. It has guided my 50-plus years here. And for the past 25 years, everyone who gets tenured in my department receives this replica. But what I really want to say is not only finding the truth. It's what we do in the process of finding the truth and what we do after we find the truth, beyond publishing a paper in Science magazine. Thank you all very much.
Amen.